To some women who met him, he was smooth, charming, and charismatic. To others, he was their worst nightmare, cold-blooded and vicious with no regard to human life. For months, he both reigned terror and spread charm across the country, earning himself the nickname Casanova Killer. His real name is Paul John Knowles, and this is his story.
I'm really surprised that he, quote, has not gotten the notoriety that Ted Bundy got, Charles Manson got, because he was more brutal than Ted Bundy, more brutal than Manson. I think he was more vicious than Bundy was.
Now you may notice that Mama's eyebrows are already done. That's because this is my second time filming this video. I just got filming halfway through because I was headed in a good promising direction, but then I started using yellow. And we all know yellow eyeshadows are trash, but you know how sometimes you got that one friend that you know she might act up, but you still invite her to the party because she just might act right this time? Baby, yellow came in, starting fights, throwing chairs, girl, yelling and screaming, just fucking up the whole thing. So I said, not today, Satan. I'm starting over. I was looking every bit of a fool, okay? Paul John Knowles was born in Orlando, Florida, April 17th, 1946, making him an Aries. I don't know, something about y'all people I'm noticing that's born around that time of the year. Let me not, because I think Scorpios and Pisces are like the highest running, and I'm a Scorpio. So I really ain't got much room to talk. Paul's parents did not have much money. They had a total of 5 children to take care of, so that really made things tight. They lived in a really small house. They reportedly only had 1 bedroom and also had an outhouse for a bathroom. The struggle was real. But they did the best that they could to take care of the children and provide for them financially. He had a pretty good relationship with his mother. He really admired her. She was really nice to him, but his father, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. He was a very, very strict man, and he was very much abusive. Paul would often run to the nearby woods outside their home to hide out from his father to avoid his wrath. But it wasn't long before Paul began lashing out outside the house, like at school. He was very much a class clown. He would show out with the teachers, honey. He wasn't trying to do anything that they tried to instruct him to do. This got him a lot of attention from the other kids who thought it was funny. They would laugh at him. They were very much amused by his antics, and this positive reinforcement that he received from his fellow classmates, it really encouraged him to keep it going. He really liked all the attention that he got. Now, it also resulted in him receiving more of the harsh discipline from his father that he would get when he wasn't even doing anything. But apparently to him, the attention that he received from the other kids was worth it because he continued to cut up. Now, his stunts, they gradually progressed from him just being the normal, typical class clown to him stealing. Sis liked to steal, okay? At just the age of 7, he steals a bicycle from one of the neighborhood kids, and he is, of course, caught. When he's caught, his dad is like, you know what? This is the final straw. I have all of these kids and a wife to take care of. I ain't got time for the mess. And so he decides to give Paul up for adoption, turn him over to the state, and just wash his hands of little Paul once and for all. When this happens, Paul is sent off to the Dozier School Home for Boys. It's a reformatory school in Marianna, Florida, and he remains here until his early teen years. Now, this was not the best place for him because this place was horrible. They were known for their extreme brutality and was actually forced to close down in 2011. During their years of operation, boys whose spirits could not easily be broken were known as the White House Boys, and they were sent over to a special building, which of course is called the White House. Over at the White House, the punishments were much more severe than at the main building. The boys were severely beaten. They were assaulted sexually by the guards. Many of the boys actually lost their lives due to the severe punishment over in the White House building. The state investigation that actually resulted in their closing uncovered at least 81 child deaths that had happened at the hands of the guards due to just the abuse or neglect. Needless to say, the Reformatory did not reform Paul at all. The reform school actually worsened his behavior because now, instead of him just, stealing a little bit, being a little bad, he actually was a lot more cold and had a lot less regard for human life. As a young adult, Paul grew to be 6 feet tall. He had this nice, thick, long red hair and was reportedly a very handsome man. I insert the pictures, baby, and allow you to be the judge, okay? He also had this very, very charming personality and was a hit with the ladies, y'all. The ladies loved them some Paul, okay? And while his looks had gotten better over time, unfortunately, his behavior had not. You know what they say? Young fools just grow to be old fools, child. By the time he was 19 years old, he had graduated from bike theft to car theft. One night during a typical night out on the town for Paul, you know, still in a car, a police officer gets behind him, turns on the lights, and attempts to pull Paul over. Paul pulls over as he is asked to, and he sits in the car looking at the officer, watching the officer approach the vehicle in his rearview mirror, calculating his next move, honey, because as soon as the officer comes and approaches the window and leans forward, Paul manages to disarm him by grabbing his gun out of his holster and turns it on the officer, demanding him to get into the vehicle. Yes, honey, he kidnaps the police, takes the officer hostage, driving him around for 2 hours before he decides to just let the man go. After serving a brief stint in prison for this, he gets out, he goes down to the bar, and he meets a woman by the name of Jackie Knight. Miss Jackie Knight is married and has 3 children, but that didn't stop sis, because the two strike up a conversation. They're flirting. They find that they have a lot in common. And she finds him to be extremely charming and very handsome. And so the two exchange numbers. And from there, they begin an affair. Jackie and Paul, their relationship gets pretty serious for a little side relationship. She introduces him to the children. They go out on play dates with the kids. Like, it was a whole thing. But Paul, however, we know how he gets down, and so it's not long before he lands himself back in prison. But the two continue their relationship. Sis was down for him. She was down to wait. While he is in prison, she actually leaves her husband, divorces him, and then Paul writes her a letter asking for her hand in marriage, to which she actually accepts. He really liked Jackie, and by this time, he had spent a lot of time with the kids. They had a relationship as well. He enjoyed the kids. He enjoyed Jackie, and he was just ready to be a family man and turn his life around and just be the husband that little old Jackie deserved. Or maybe she didn't deserve, because she was a cheater. But I ain't here to judge. I'm just here to tell the story. As soon as he is released, he commits to Jackie. He marries her as he had promised to do behind bars. It wasn't just prison talk. The part about him being on the straight and narrow and leaving behind the foolishness, that wasn't true. He reconnected with his old friends who were not the best influence on him, and it wasn't long before he was back to his old ways, out in the streets, committing crimes and all of the things. But Jackie didn't have time for that, because she is a mother of 3 children. She ain't got time to play these little reindeer games. So she decides to take her children and move to Georgia and get their marriage annulled. After Jackie leaves him, instead of him going to cry all by his lonesome, he goes out and commits burglary, which lands him right back in jail. But one thing about Paul, he gonna have him a little prison bag. In early 1974, while in prison, he begins corresponding with a woman by the name of Angela Kovic. Angela was a recently divorced waitress in San Francisco, California, and sis was more than happy to be his girlfriend on the outside. They began writing each other frequently all the time. She actually begins flying out there to visit him in person, you know, doing all of the things that you do when you got a little jail bae. And after a few letters and a few trips, sis was completely in love, and he was in love with her as well. They were both in love, allegedly. It was not long before Paul makes Angela the ultimate prison promise, and he tells her that he's going to marry her when he gets out. She accepts his proposal because sis is in love, and she could not wait to start her new life with her future husband. She was really looking forward to her life with Paul, as he had promised her that it would be, and she didn't want to wait any longer for him to come home. So she decides to hire him a lawyer that could potentially get him out early and home to her where he belonged. Angela was actually pretty good for Paul. He was excited about his new life with her as well. He really was genuinely looking forward to starting a new life leaving behind the old one and just getting his shit together. He had even began taking online courses and classes and looking at jobs that would be available to him in the San Francisco area where she lived, because he wanted to go be where she was. He didn't want her to come to Florida because he felt like he had too much bad influence where he was from, and that it would just be too easy for him to slip back into his old ways. He did not want that. He had already messed up his previous marriage with Jackie, and he just didn't want the same thing to happen the second go round. Now, the lawyer that she hires is actually able to get him released early on parole. Angela flies Paul right out to San Francisco immediately. The two spend a very short time together before Angela decides that she wants to call off the engagement. Two things led her to make this decision. One, she had the opportunity to spend like a good amount of time with him one-on-one in the real world, and she had noticed some things about his personality that scared her. And second, right before he came to San Francisco, she had met with a psychic who warned her about a dangerous new man in her life. And Angela said that his aura paired with the warning that she received from the psychic was enough for her to call things off and end it with Paul and decide that, you know, this probably was not the best decision. So she calls it off, and Paul is devastated. This is a major blow for him because he had made a lot of strides and effort to turn his life around and just be this new good person and have this second chance at love. But Angela was not trying to risk it. She was like, nah, the psychic gotta be talking about you, so you gotta go. And then of course whatever other characteristics that he had displayed that scared her. So that was pretty much it for that. It was over, and it just as quick as it had started. Now, according to Paul, he went out and he murdered 3 people that night, but those alleged 3 victims that he's claiming have never been confirmed. But that doesn't necessarily mean it really didn't happen. We'll get there. The very next day, he flees San Francisco and returns to Florida, Jacksonville to be exact. He goes out to the bar, has himself a couple of drinks, but then he gets into a bar fight, and the bouncer breaks up the fight. But then Paul pulls out a little knife and uses one of his little jailhouse tricks that he learned, girl, and shanked him. But he didn't die. He was just injured a little bit. And of course, they call the police. Paul is picked up and taken back down to the jailhouse for this offense. But he did not want to be there. On July 26, 1974, he actually picks the lock on his cell and manages to escape. And baby, here I am, can't even get my keys out the car when I lock them in there. He escaping a whole jail cell. Desperate for money, he enters the home of a 65-year-old retired school teacher who is in her house sleeping alone. He ties her up, places a gag over her mouth, and then he proceeds to burglarize her home and takes off in her car afterwards. He does not go back and check on her or untie her. Sometime during all of this, whatever he had placed over her mouth caused her dentures to loosen, and she ends up choking on them. So granted, he wasn't intentionally trying to, you know, take Sis's life. He's still responsible. But he does not know this yet. He just knows that he's in a stolen car and is trying to get far away from the actual crime scene. A few hours later, he is driving through a neighborhood looking for a spot to abandon the car because he figured by now he knew the police would be looking for the car, or should be. He decides on the street that he wants to leave the car and abandon it, but then he spots 2 young girls walking down the street, and he recognizes them and realizes if he recognizes them, they most certainly recognize him as well. This made them a threat in his eyes because he felt like once news hit that the car had been stolen, they could easily identify him or be a witness and testify that they had seen him in the vehicle that night. And so instead of ditching the vehicle there, he pulls up on them and forces them into his car and takes off. He drives the 2 young girls to a remote area where he strangles them both and then discards them in a swamp nearby. At this point, he figures that it is probably more important for him to get out of the area versus abandoning the car. So he uses the car to try to get a little further out of town. He travels from Florida to Georgia, then up to Connecticut. So this was all over the place in the stolen vehicle still. And he is not just driving, he is leaving a trail of victims behind him. His next victim was a young girl who had run away from home. She was actually hitchhiking to Georgia. He picked her up with the promise of taking her there the rest of the way, but unfortunately she meets a fate similar to the two girls before her. The very next day, he meets a woman by the name of Marjorie Howie. Marjorie found him to be very, very charismatic, very charming, very handsome, and she believes that he has a genuine interest in her as well, and so she invites him back to her apartment. But once they get there, Paul wraps a pair of nylon stockings around her neck and chokes her out. He then steals her TV and heads down to Georgia. Since their divorce, he and Jackie had actually kept in contact, and they had a pretty decent relationship. He still talked to the kids regularly. He still spoke to her and would visit them every now and then. So he goes down to Georgia, gives the TV to Jackie, and when she asked him where he had gotten the TV from, because it wasn't in any kind of packaging or anything, he jokingly tells her that he had stolen it. And she takes it as a joke. She just laughed it off because he presented it as a joke. And Jackie claims that it wasn't until all of his actions came to light that she realized that he wasn't joking at all. But I don't know, I feel like if you kind of know him for his works, girl, you know how he get down. You should have known he probably wasn't joking at all. Maybe sis did know, and she just wanted that TV. That's what I think. He spends some time with Jackie and the kids before he decides that it's time for him to take off on his next venture. And this actually becomes a pattern for him. He would steal valuables from his victims, bring them back as gifts to the kids and to Jackie, spend a little time with them, and be gone again. And the two always remained on good terms. But before he would head out, he would also claim another victim. While in town during one of his visits to Jackie and the kids, he enters the home of a woman by the name of Kathy Pierce. Kathy was at home during the time with her 3-year-old son, just the two of them. He strangles Kathy in front of her child, but he leaves the child unharmed. Police had begun finding his victims, but for most of his spree, they were completely baffled by the crime scenes because they were completely random. Most of the victims he picked up at a bar. Some of them were women that he picked up. He also frequented the gay bars and picked up men as well. The victims and the crime scenes were so completely random that they appeared to have no sort of rhyme or reason to them at all. It also appeared that there was no pattern between any of the crime scenes or any of the victims. Of the 20 people that they had found, 14 were female, 6 were male, 3 of them were children, 3 of them were elderly. Like, his victim selection was really just all over the place when nobody's safe. Speaking of nobody's safe, I wonder how many of y'all's significant others are low-key a little worried that y'all are so into these kind of videos. Even the ones that watch them with y'all, I think they probably still low-key scared. You better keep your eye on sis, especially if she a Pisces child. Just saying. But she my girl though. Or whatever. His actions were too random for police to put together a profile. His victims, they crossed all demographics except for one. If he ever ran across a young boy, he would leave them unharmed, much like he left Kathy's 3-year-old unharmed. He never hurt a young boy. Now, it is speculated, and I agree, because I can see this being the truth, that the young boys will remind him of the things that he had seen at the Dozier School for Boys. And that has something to do with the fact that he would not harm a young boy. Y'all don't ask me exactly how, because I'm not the one with the psychology degree, okay? So I can't tell you, but I do feel like it's definitely related. On September 23rd, 1974, Paul meets a woman by the name of Ann Dawson down in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's the first time in months that he seemingly had a new love interest and had somebody that he could see as a companion. He is spending time with Ann day in and day out. After about a week though, he grows tired of Ann and decides to make this his next victim instead of his next wife. He then throws her into the Mississippi River and goes back out on his spree. Whoever told me about using these little things to pick up like hard to grab shimmers and stuff that probably aren't the best quality, or aren't that buttery, you're a godsend. I asked for the gods and the universes to bless you back then, and child, I'm asking again today. One of the best little hacks, hands down. Once he gets rid of Ann, he picks up a tape recorder so he can begin to record confessions and details of every crime after he commits them, like in real time. Meanwhile, the good old authorities are no closer to catching him or identifying him, finding out who it even possibly could be, than they were on the first day of their little investigation starting. And they'd actually gotten so close to catching a suspect and didn't even realize it. In late October, while driving one of the cars that belonged to one of his previous victims, who had not yet been found but had been reported missing, he picked up two male hitchhikers. He picked them up in Key West, Florida, and they were hitchhiking up to Miami, but of course he had no intention of actually taking them to Miami. However, his plans are soiled when an officer pulls him over for a traffic violation. The officer is unaware that the car is stolen, unaware that little old Paul is a naughty boy, and so he lets Paul go with just a warning. The two hitchhikers, they had no idea that they were in danger either. This incident shook Paul so much that he decided not to go through with his plans, and he actually does drop them off in Miami and lets them go without incident. Now, after this happens, Paul contacts his lawyer and pretty much tells him what he had been up to. The lawyer tries to persuade him to turn himself in, but he tells the lawyer, hell no, I'm not turning myself in. That's the last thing I'm going to do, in fact. He said instead he wanted to go out on a blaze of glory and be as famous and well known as Bonnie and Clyde. He also said that he knew that if he was captured, he'd be given the chair, and he wasn't trying to go down like that. He was afraid of the chair, and he wasn't going to let that happen. He does, however, agree to have a brief meeting with the lawyer, and during this meeting, he actually hands the lawyer over the tapes that he had recorded of himself with the details of his crimes, and he tells him not to hand them over to police until he is no more. Not until his life is good and over is he allowed to give those tapes to authorities. The lawyer agrees, takes the tapes, and Paul goes on about his way. Now, one night in a bar, Paul meets a woman by the name of Sandy Fox. She is a British journalist who found Paul very, very attractive. He introduces himself as Daryl Golden, and the two, they get wrapped up in this long conversation. She's enjoying him, he's enjoying her, the norm. And then he begins to flirt with her, like heavy. After some time goes by, she invites him back to her hotel room, which he agrees. They go back to her room, and Sis struggles to perform, child. His little soldier didn't want to march. Nevertheless, they spend the night together and go on to actually spend the next 3 days together. During these 3 days they spent together, a couple of things about Paul strike Sandy as odd. One, she had noticed that he had started to tear out like newspaper articles about the crimes that he had committed, but of course she didn't know that he was the one committing them. She just was like, why are you interested in this? It's kind of strange that you're collecting these. And two, he had told her that he knew that he was going to die young, and because she was a writer, he asked her to write a piece about him after the fact, and she thought that was kind of weird, which it is. Not once during their 3-day stint did he show any sign of wanting to cause her harm or wanting to hurt her. No signs of anger or rage at all. She had no idea that he was the infamous Casanova killer, as he had now been dubbed by the media. He seemed really intrigued by the fact that she was a writer. When they discussed her writing a book about his life, he also told her that his lawyer had tapes that would make him very famous one day. He hoped that between the tapes and her writing this book about him, that it would garner him even more like fame and notoriety long after he was gone. That was a goal of his, to just be remembered forever. Now, Sandy claims that she thought he may have been a hitman or that he might have been on the run for something, but she had no suspicion that he was who he was. About a month after his 3-day rendezvous with little Miss Sandy Fox, on November 17th, a Florida highway patrolman recognizes a car matching the description of one stolen from Paul's most recent victim. He pulls the car over, not knowing that he had just cornered a whole police abductor child. Paul was more than ready. He is sitting there watching the officer approach the vehicle in his rearview mirror, and as soon as the officer gets close to that window, he manages to pull his little stunt, do his little trick, disarm the cop, and turn the gun on him. He then forces the cop into the patrol car, and then he takes off in the patrol car with the police officer in the back. Now, he knows that he has to get out of this patrol car ASAP. He spots another vehicle on the road, turns on the sirens, and pulls that car over as if he's the officer. When he approaches the vehicle, Paul forces the officer into the other car, forces the driver of this car into the back as well, and he takes them both as hostages and pulls off, abandoning the patrol car right there on the side of the road. Now, he is trying to figure out his next plan, and of course that can include him carrying around two grown men who were very much unwilling participants. So he takes them out to a wooded, remote area, handcuffs them together like around a tree to where they're like as if they would be holding hands around a tree. I hope I described that right. Both of them are shot and he returns to the car and takes off. Now, as he's attempting to escape the scene of the crime, he runs into a tree. Crashes right into a tree. Just stupid. And at this point, he is forced to take off on foot. By now, police know and identify the perimeter in which he should be, and they establish a manhunt for the area. They have police driving around, they have bloodhounds out sniffing the grass, they have helicopters circling around the perimeter. Even with all of that and being on foot, he manages to escape that area, but he didn't make it far outside that perimeter. He runs into two men. One is a 27-year-old Vietnam veteran. The other was a hospital maintenance worker, and they immediately recognize him. Both of them are armed, so they take him as a hostage and hold him until they can get the police on the phone and on the scene. And this, of course, results in Paul being arrested. Now, once arrested, he confesses to 35 total victims. But that is pretty much all that he would tell police. He wouldn't give them any kind of details at all. He would only tell them the number, no names, no locations, nothing. For a whole month, they hold him, hoping that he would give some sort of confession, but all he would say is that he'd already recorded his legacy and that he was not giving them a confession. He also tells them that his recorded legacy is in the possession of his lawyer, and his lawyer would not be handing them over until after his death. And the lawyer held on to his promise. He did not have your typical clientele. All of this lawyer's clientele were high-profile criminals, so this kind of thing wasn't really new to him. And his style of defense wasn't even to prove his client to be innocent. He knew they weren't innocent. It probably wasn't going to be possible to prove their innocence. Okay, the innocence did not exist, and he was not going to try. His specialty and his focus was to find loopholes that would get them free or get them like a far less sentence than what they would have gotten or should have gotten. The lawyer is ordered to hand over the tapes immediately, and he refuses to do so. He is loyal to his client, and he says that he made the agreement not to hand him over while he was living, and he refused to do so. So they picked him up and arrested his ass too, held him in contempt of court. He didn't care. He was still sitting there. But then they ultimately picked up his wife as well and were able to hold her in contempt of court. And so in exchange for her freedom, he handed over the tapes to authorities, and now he was just stuck in jail, child. On December 18th, exactly a month after his arrest, Paul agrees to throw police a bone by showing them where he discarded one of the weapons. Even with the tapes, they still had not found much evidence on their own. And so they were elated and jumped at this opportunity to find some piece of evidence, something to help them out. Two police officers are transporting a very much handcuffed Paul in one of the patrol cars that didn't have like the glass or the cage that separated the back from the front. And y'all already know what Paul gives, child. While en route, he manages to pick the lock on his handcuffs and Sis lights up a cigarette. Now the officer in the front turns around and is like, "Excuse me, where you get that from and how did you light it if you handcuffed?" And he realizes that Sis ain't handcuffed at all, not no more. The officer orders Paul to hand over the cigarette. He very calmly ashes the cigarette and then all of a sudden lunges forward at the officer, trying to grab the gun out of his holster. Now he ends up firing the gun twice, and so this causes the police officer that's driving to lose control and completely veer off the highway, while Paul and the other officer are still tussling back and forth. Once the car comes to a complete stop, the driving officer retrieves his gun and fires 3 shots into Paul, killing him instantly. He was 28 years old. Now, one of his lawyers came forward and tried to have charges brought up against the 2 police officers that were transporting him that day, accusing them of taking Paul's execution upon their own hands. And they actually presented a letter that Paul had written to his cellmate a week prior that stated that he feared for his life, that he was afraid that they might try to take him out before his trial date. But his history of breaking free and disarming police officers quickly put all of that to rest. And it was enough for the courts to clear both officers of any wrongdoing. They was like, girl, nice try. That was cute that you had set that up a week prior or whatever. But no. Unfortunately, police were only able to locate 20 of his victims, and the story of the Casanova killer comes to an end. Kinda. Because Sandy, you remember Sandy Fox, the little writer girl? She actually honored Paul's request and wrote several books about him. One of them was about her being in love with him. I'm like, he must have really been that girl if y'all fall in love through prison letters and after 3 days. Like, girl, what was he telling y'all? But unfortunately, even with him going out on a blaze of glory like he wanted, and the books and the media attention that he had, he didn't garner nearly as much notoriety and fame as Bonnie and Clyde did. So that was a fail. Paul, as well as his little belongings from his jail cell, were returned to his family for a proper burial. And Angela Kovic, the fiance that had gotten their warning from the psychic and dumped him, she flew in to be with the family and attend his services. She said that she believed, even knowing all that he had done, that he was the love of her life and she was the Bonnie to his Clyde. She said that had he managed to escape this last time, that she would have run away with him. Girl, a mess. Child, the dating scene must have really sucked after he left. At his funeral, it was just her and a few of his family members, and the priest flat out refused to pray for sis to rest in peace, okay? He said, he going to hell, and we gonna leave it at that. The shade. And that is it for this story and this video. I hope you liked the video. I hope you liked the look. If you did, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Y'all know that helps me out a whole lot, and I appreciate it so much. Share this video with a friend. Subscribe if you have not. Y'all, we are so close to 100,000. I can taste it, okay? I am so grateful for everybody who has joined the family so far. As always, I appreciate you so much for spending time with me, and I will see you in the next one. Peace. His real name is Paul John Knowles, and this is his story. And before y'all ask, no, he's not related to Beyonce, okay? Little Paul once and for all. During their years of operations, the severe punishment is the harm Paul at all. I'm on a roll today with the bars, I promise. This is ridiculous. And from there, they begin an affair. Am I gonna run the whole video? This is insane. Sign me already, somebody. 2 things led her to the